He looked at those three children standing on the depot platform and said it loud enough for the whole town to hear. "I didn't order a widow with 3 mouths to feed." Cora Whitlock didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't cry. She simply bent down, picked up the smallest bag, handed the 2 larger ones to her oldest children, and turned her back on Silas Boone without a single word. He watched her walk away, spine straight, chin up, 3 kids trailing behind her like ducklings into a blizzard. And something inside his chest cracked open in a way he hadn't felt since the day he buried his son. She was going to sit in that freezing depot for 4 days and wait for the next train. 4 days. With children. And he just stood there. If that were you, would you have walked away? Or would something have stopped you? Stay with this story. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that button now, because stories like this one don't come around twice. Smash the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The telegram had said 1 child. 1. That was the word written on the paper Silas Boone had read so many times the fold lines had gone white. He'd kept it in his breast pocket for 11 weeks, through 2 blizzards and a fence collapse, and one very long Sunday afternoon when he'd sat at his kitchen table and tried to remember what it felt like to look forward to something. 1 child. Widow. Hardworking. Honest. Those were the words the matchmaking bureau out of St. Louis had used. He hadn't expected poetry. He hadn't expected much of anything. He just needed someone who could keep a house and maybe, eventually, make the silence inside his 4 walls a little less loud. He'd ridden into Ash Hollow Crossing that Tuesday morning with his jaw set and his coat buttoned wrong. He noticed that halfway through town and didn't bother fixing it. He tied his horse at the post outside the depot, pulled his hat brim low against the November wind, and waited. The train was 20 minutes late. He stood with his arms crossed and watched a tumbleweed roll across the empty road and thought, not for the first time, that he might be making a serious mistake. Then the train came. And then Cora Whitlock stepped onto that platform. She was smaller than he'd expected. Dark hair pulled back tight, a travel coat that had seen better years, a carpet bag in each hand. She had the kind of face that didn't ask for anything from anybody. Not sympathy, not patience, not a second look. She spotted him immediately, which surprised him, and walked toward him with a directness that made him straighten up without meaning to. "Mr. Boone," she said. Not a question. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said back. And then the train door opened again. A boy climbed down first, maybe 10 years old, serious-faced, with his mother's dark eyes and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder like he'd been carrying weight since before he was ready for it. He stood beside Cora without being told to and looked at Silas with an expression that wasn't hostility exactly, more like careful measurement, like he was deciding something. Then came a girl, older than the boy by a year or 2, Silas guessed, 12 at most, with her hair braided and her jaw set almost identically to her mother's. She carried a small crate in both arms and managed it without complaint. Then the third one came through the door, and Silas felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the November air. She was tiny. 4 years old, maybe 5. Red mittens. A coat 2 sizes too big. She looked at Silas with enormous brown eyes and absolutely no fear whatsoever, which somehow made everything worse. Silas counted. He recounted. He looked at Cora. "The telegram said 1 child," he said. Cora didn't look away from him. "It did." "That's 3. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Boone." He pulled the telegram from his breast pocket and held it out, not because he thought she couldn't read, but because he genuinely didn't know what else to do with his hands. She glanced at it. She didn't take it. "The Bureau made an error," she said, her voice level, like she was reporting weather. "I wrote to correct it twice. I don't know if those letters arrived." "They didn't." "I see." He stood there. The wind pushed between them. I was aware that old Tom Garrett from the feed store was watching from across the road, and that the depot agent had found a reason to linger near the window, and that the whole sorry scene was being observed by at least 4 other people who would repeat every word of it by supper time. And then, because he was tired and cold and had been standing here rehearsing a version of this morning that bore no resemblance to what was actually happening, he said it. Not cruelly, not loudly, just flatly, the way a man states a fact he doesn't want to be a fact. I didn't order a widow with 3 mouths to feed. He watched the words land, watched her absorb them, watched nothing in her face break open the way he half expected it to. She nodded once, very slightly. Then she bent down and picked up the smallest bag and handed the larger ones to the boy and the girl without a single spoken instruction, just a look, and they each took what she gave them without complaint. She settled the little one, Lucy, he would learn, onto her hip like this was something she'd done 10,000 times, which it probably was. And then she walked toward the depot bench. Not toward the road, not toward him, toward the bench inside the station where people waited. He stood there. "Where do you think you're going?" She didn't turn around. "To wait for the next train. The next train doesn't come through for 4 days." "I know. It'll be below freezing tonight." She sat down on the bench, settled Lucy beside her, and looked up at him with an expression so completely composed that it made his back teeth ache. "I know that too, Mr. Boone." He opened his mouth, closed it. Old Tom Garrett was definitely still watching. He could feel it. The boy, Noah, Silas would learn, had set his duffel down and was looking at his mother with a careful, protective expression that Silas recognized because he'd worn something like it himself once, a long time ago, when he was too young to carry what he was carrying. The girl, Emma, had her arms around the crate and her eyes on the floor, but her jaw was still set, still tight, and Silas could see she was working very hard not to look at him. 4 days. 3 children. November. He stood in the middle of that platform for a long moment, looking at this woman who refused to beg him for anything, and felt something in his chest do something he hadn't expected it to do. Not warmth, exactly. Not sympathy. More like recognition. The particular kind of recognition a person feels when they encounter someone else who has learned to survive without making their survival anyone else's problem. He hated it. "There's a spare room," he said finally, "and a back room with 2 bunks. They're not—" He stopped, started again. "They're not cleaned out. But there's space." Cora looked at him steadily. "We're not your obligation, Mr. Boone." "I didn't say you were. You were thinking it." He couldn't argue with that because she was right, and they both knew it. "I've got a ranch to run," he said. "I need someone who can keep a house. That's what I arranged for. The number of children was—" He stopped again. He wasn't good at this. He hadn't been good at this even before 11 years of living alone had made him worse. "I need to think about what the arrangement looks like now." "That's reasonable," she said. "So you'll come." "For tonight," she said. "In the morning, we'll talk. And if we can't agree on something fair, we'll come back here and wait for the train." "Fair," he repeated. "Yes, Mr. Boone, fair." She stood up, settled Lucy back on her hip, and looked at him in a way that made him feel uncomfortably that he was the one being evaluated. "I didn't come here to be someone's burden either." He went and got his wagon. The ride out to the ranch took 40 minutes, and almost none of it was spoken. The wind was picking up, coming down hard off the hills to the north, and the children sat in the back with their bags and their crate, and, he noticed, glancing back once, with their mother's old coat thrown over them even though she was sitting up front beside him without it, and must have been cold as anything. She didn't mention it. He didn't comment on it. He stared at the road and turned the situation over in his mind, the way you turn a problem in your hands when you know the shape of it, but can't figure what to do with it yet. He'd had a plan. Not a grand plan. Silas Boone hadn't had anything he'd call grand in a long time, but a workable one. A woman to run the house. Eventually, maybe, something more than that. The letters he and Cora had exchanged over 3 months had been careful and honest and at times, he had to admit, almost good. She wrote plainly, without decoration, and she asked him questions about the ranch that showed she was thinking practically about what she was walking into. He'd respected that. He'd found himself looking forward to her letters in a way that embarrassed him slightly whenever he caught himself doing it. None of those letters had mentioned 3 children. He understood, sitting there on that wagon bench, why she might not have told him. He understood it and was still angry about it, and being both things at once was not a comfortable place to be. When they pulled up to the house, the sky had gone slate gray, and the first real fingers of cold were reaching down from the north. He climbed down and went to tie the horse, and by the time he turned around, Cora was already lifting things out of the wagon. Not waiting for direction, not waiting for him to decide whether he was going to help, just working. The boy jumped down and took the heavier crate without being asked. The girl helped Lucy with her coat buttons. Silas watched this and thought, they've done this before. Arrived somewhere new and uncertain and just gotten on with it. He picked up the last 2 bags himself and took them inside. The house was clean enough. He wasn't a filthy man, just a spare one. But it was also obviously a place where no softness had lived for a long time. 1 iron skillet. 4 plates, though only one of them ever got used. A table with 2 chairs. A fireplace he'd let go cold because starting it every night for one person felt like a lot of effort. Lucy walked in and looked around with her enormous eyes and said, very clearly and with complete seriousness, "It smells sad." Emma made a strangled noise. Noah closed his eyes briefly. Silas stood in the doorway with 2 bags in his hands and had absolutely no idea what to do with that statement. Cora crouched down to Lucy's height and said, very quietly, "That's not polite to say, Bug." "But it does," Lucy said. "I know," Cora said, "but we're guests here." Lucy looked at Silas with an expression of absolute uncomplicated apology. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't mean bad sorry. I meant the kind of sad that needs a fire." He started the fire. He didn't make a production of it. He just went and did it, and while he was doing it, he heard Cora moving around the kitchen, heard the pump handle, heard something being unwrapped from cloth. She'd brought food, he realized. She'd packed food because she wasn't certain what she'd find when she arrived. And the smell of something warming on the stove started mixing with the smell of the fire catching, and the house did, in fact, start to smell like something other than sad. He stayed in the front room. She stayed in the kitchen. The children moved between both spaces with the natural territorial ease of kids who are used to navigating uncertain adults. Dinner was quiet. Not hostile, just careful. He ate what she'd made, which was simple and good, and said so, which seemed to surprise her slightly, which told him something about what she'd been expecting from him. Noah asked him one question about the ranch, something specific about whether the winter feed stores would last if the snow came early. And Silas answered it honestly, including the parts he wasn't sure about, and caught the boy listening with the same focused attention his mother gave to everything. After dinner, Cora cleaned up while the children settled in the back room, and Silas sat at the table with a cup of coffee. He didn't drink and thought about what was happening in his house. "You should have told me," he said when she came back through. She stood at the other end of the table. "Yes," she said. "I should have." "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. Not defensive, more like deciding how honest to be. "Because I was afraid you'd say no before you knew us," she said finally. "And I thought if you knew us first, even just through letters, you might—" She stopped. "I know that was wrong. I knew it then. I did it anyway." He looked at her. "That wasn't fair to me." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I told you what I needed, someone to help run this place. That's still true. But 3 children changes what's possible here, changes the costs, changes—" He stopped. "It's not that I have something against children." Something flickered in her face. Very fast. Gone before he could name it. "I know," she said. He didn't know how she knew, and he didn't ask. 2 weeks, he said. "We try it for 2 weeks. You keep the house, I'll work the ranch, and we figure out if this can work. If it can't, I'll pay for your train tickets myself, all 4 of them." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if it can work?" He hadn't thought that far. He realized, sitting there, that he hadn't let himself think that far. "We'll talk about it," he said. She nodded. "All right, Mr. Boone." "Silas," he said, without planning to. She almost smiled. Not quite. "All right, Silas." She went to bed. He sat at his table with his cold coffee for another hour, listening to the wind outside and the unfamiliar sound of people breathing in the rooms around him, and tried to figure out what had just happened to his quiet, controlled, carefully arranged life. Outside, the November cold pressed against every window. Inside, for the first time in 11 years, the fire burned until morning. He hadn't told her to keep it going. She just had. He noticed that. He wasn't sure yet what to do with it, but he noticed it. And somewhere in the back room, a little girl in red mittens slept in a strange bed in a strange house, completely unafraid. Because as far as Lucy Whitlock was concerned, any place that had a fire burning wasn't a place that wanted them gone. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't know yet how much work it was going to take to prove that to the man sitting alone on the other side of the wall. The fire had been going every morning for 6 days before Silas stopped pretending he hadn't noticed. He'd come downstairs each dawn expecting to find cold ash, and instead found the grate already stoked, the kitchen already warming, Cora already moving around in the half-dark, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that mornings don't wait for anyone to feel ready. He didn't comment on it. She didn't draw attention to it. But on the 7th morning, when he came down and found the fire cold for the first time, she'd run out of the smaller kindling she'd been using and hadn't wanted to take from his main stack without asking. He stood in front of the empty grate for a moment, surprised by how wrong it felt, and that surprise bothered him more than the cold did. He got the fire going himself and didn't say anything about it. But he split extra kindling that afternoon and left it in a pile beside the kitchen door where she could reach it easily, and she didn't say anything about that either, and somehow that arrangement, that small, wordless negotiation, became the first thing on the ranch that belonged to both of them. The work was not gentle, and it was not romantic, and nobody was pretending otherwise. Cora's hands were cracked by the end of the first week. The well pump froze on day 4, and she'd gone out in the pre-dawn dark to work it loose herself before anyone else was awake. And Silas had found her there when he came out for morning chores, knuckles red, breath coming in hard white clouds, and she'd looked up at him without embarrassment and said simply, "I got it." And he'd looked at the pump and then at her hands and said, "I'll wrap that handle with burlap tonight so it doesn't pull the heat out so fast." And she'd said, "That'd help." And they'd gone about their separate mornings. The children were a different kind of problem. Not a bad one, just one he hadn't calculated for. Noah was up before sunrise every day, and Silas kept finding him in places he hadn't sent him. Standing at the fence, watching how Silas moved the cattle from one pasture to the next. Sitting on the top rail of the barn stall while Silas worked on a harness that needed new stitching. Watching his hands with that same focused, measuring look he'd had on the depot platform. The boy didn't chatter, didn't ask a stream of questions. He'd ask one thing, absorb the answer completely, and not ask another one until he'd thought about it. That was the part that got under Silas's defenses before he realized it was happening, because that was how Silas himself had been taught, by a father who believed in watching before talking and thinking before doing. On the 8th day, without planning to, he handed Noah one end of a fence post and showed him how to set it right. The boy didn't say thank you in a big way. He just nodded and did what he was shown and did it correctly on the second try, and Silas thought his father taught him something before he died. He didn't know why that made his chest tighten, but it did. Emma was harder to read. She was almost 13 and she'd taken on a shape of responsibility that was too large for her shoulders, and she wore it like she'd forgotten it was heavy. She organized the back room without being asked, stacked the children's things neatly, kept track of Lucy's mittens with a thoroughness that bordered on fierce. Inside the house, she moved around Cora like a second set of hands, anticipating what was needed with an efficiency that Silas recognized as something other than helpfulness. It was the coping mechanism of a child who had learned that if she stayed useful, she stayed safe. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn it himself, briefly, after his own mother died when he was 14. He didn't try to talk to Emma directly. He had enough sense to know that would go badly. But he started leaving small things in her general vicinity. A sturdier wood box near the kitchen stove so she didn't have to make as many trips. A piece of salvaged leather she could use to mend the strap on the crate she kept fussing with. She noticed. He could tell because the second morning after he left the leather strip, he found the crate strap mended and sitting on the kitchen table where he'd see it, which was as close to a thank you as Emma was going to give anyone she hadn't yet decided to trust. And then there was Lucy. Lucy was a problem of an entirely different order. She was 5 years old and completely without fear of him, which was something no adult in Ash Hollow Crossing had managed in about a decade. On the 3rd day, she had walked directly up to him while he was eating lunch alone at the table. Cora had taken the other 2 children outside for something, and climbed up onto the chair across from him without asking permission, and said, "What's your favorite color?" He stared at her. "What?" "Your favorite color," she said patiently, like he might be a little slow. "Mine's yellow, but not regular yellow. The yellow that's almost orange, like fire." He looked at his plate. "Brown," he said, because it was the first thing that came to mind. Lucy considered this seriously. "Like dirt?" He stopped. "Like good leather." She nodded, apparently satisfied. That's a real person answer, she said. Mama says when people give real person answers, it means they're not showing off. She slid off the chair and went back outside, and Silas sat there with his fork in his hand and something in his expression that nobody was around to see, which was probably for the best. After that, she appeared regularly. Not constantly. Cora kept the children from underfoot during working hours, and he could see the effort that cost, the quiet corrections, the redirections. But Lucy had a particular gift for finding the exact moment when he was alone and stationary and not quite braced. She didn't demand anything. She just arrived and said whatever was in her head and sometimes stayed and sometimes left. And Silas found himself, against every intention, mildly looking forward to not knowing what she was going to say next. He was careful not to look too long at any of them. He knew what he was doing. He'd been doing it for 11 years since the winter. Margaret died, and he'd realized that the way to survive was to keep the walls high enough that nothing could get over them before he saw it coming. It worked. He was still standing. The ranch was still running. He went to town when he had to, came home when he could, and maintained a careful and complete emotional distance from anything that required him to risk anything again. The trouble was that distance was getting harder to maintain with 3 children living in his house. On the 11th night, something broke that he hadn't been watching. He'd been in the barn late, dealing with a mare who was favoring her left foreleg. Nothing serious, just needed attention and time. And when he came back toward the house around 9 o'clock, he could hear voices through the kitchen window. Cora's, low and steady, and Lucy's, high and trembling in a way he hadn't heard before. He didn't mean to stop and listen. He stopped anyway. "I miss Daddy," Lucy was saying. There was a pause. "I know, Bug. Do you miss him too?" Another pause, longer. "Yes," Cora said. "I do." "Does it always feel like this?" "No," Cora said quietly. "It gets different. Not gone. Just different. Like when you have a sore and it heals, but you can still feel where it was." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "Is that why Silas smells sad?" Silas stood outside his own kitchen window in the November dark and felt something move through him that he had absolutely no framework for handling. "I think," Cora said carefully, "that Silas has a very big sore, and it hasn't finished healing yet." "We could help," Lucy said, with complete 5-year-old certainty. "Maybe," Cora said, "but we have to let him decide that. You can't push people toward healing, Lucy. You can just be there so they know the door's open." He walked to the barn and stood in the cold for another 20 minutes before he went inside. The 2 weeks ended and nobody mentioned it. He noticed, on the morning of day 15, that the 2-week mark had passed without discussion, and that Cora hadn't brought it up, and that he hadn't either, and that the wagon hadn't been readied and nobody was packing bags. He stood in the kitchen that morning with his coffee and looked at the table, which now had 4 chairs instead of 2. He'd gotten 2 more from the back storage without making any kind of announcement about it, and thought about whether he was going to say something. He decided he wasn't. She'd keep the house. He'd run the ranch. That was what he'd said. That was what they were doing. If it continued, it continued. That was all. He was telling himself this with some conviction when Noah appeared at the kitchen door in his coat and boots, ready for morning chores, and looked at Silas with that careful, measuring expression and said, "You need help with the south fence today? I looked at it yesterday. 3rd post from the old oak is listing pretty bad." Silas looked at him. "You were checking the fence line?" "Walked it yesterday afternoon," Noah said, "when I finished splitting the kindling." He'd split the kindling too. Silas had noticed the pile was bigger but assumed Cora had done it. "Yeah," Silas said after a moment. "I could use a hand with that post." They worked the south fence for 3 hours, and it was cold enough that conversation was mostly about the work, which suited both of them. But at one point, while they were tamping the new post down, Noah said, without looking up, "My dad taught me to check fence lines. Said a rancher who doesn't walk his own property doesn't actually know what he's got." Silas kept tamping. "Your dad was right." "He died in the spring," Noah said. "A horse kicked him. He was trying to help it, and it kicked him, and he didn't come back from it." There was no drama in how he said it. "Just facts," stated plainly, with the particular flatness of someone who has said the same words enough times that they've figured out how to say them without breaking. Silas recognized that technique intimately. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it in a way that didn't feel like just words. Noah nodded, kept working. Mama said we had to figure out what was next, so we figured out what was next. He looked up then, briefly. She's good at that, figuring out what's next. Yeah, Silas said. I can see that. The post held. They walked back to the house and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had shifted in the quiet between them, some weight redistributed in a way that made the walk back easier than the walk out had been. It was Emma who created the first real confrontation. Not with Silas, with the house itself, and with the version of Silas that the house had become. He came in from the barn on a Wednesday afternoon to find her standing in the front room holding a wooden box he kept on the high shelf above the fireplace. He stopped in the doorway. "Put that back," he said. His voice came out harder than he intended. Emma froze. She had the box in both hands and her face had gone carefully neutral, but he could see the flinch she'd caught herself before it happened. She put it back on the shelf, slowly, precisely, where it had been. "I wasn't going to take it," she said. "I was dusting. It was covered in dust and I said put it back. You put it back. I did put it back." There was a silence. He was aware he'd overreacted. He didn't apologize because he wasn't ready to explain why, and an apology without explanation was worse than nothing. He went to his room and stood with one hand on the door frame for a minute, breathing through the particular kind of panic that the sight of that box still produced in him after all this time. And then he heard Cora's voice in the next room, low and private, talking to Emma. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't try to. That evening, after dinner, which was tense in a specific triangulated way, Cora waited until the children were in bed and then sat down across from him at the table and said, without preamble, "You don't have to tell me what's in the box." He looked at her. "Good. But I need to know if there are other things in this house that my children shouldn't touch, so I can tell them, so it doesn't happen again." He looked at his hands. "Just the box." She nodded, started to get up. "It was my son's," he said. She sat back down, not in a way that demanded more, but just in a way that said she wasn't leaving. "He didn't—" Silas stopped, started again, because stopping was worse. "He was born early. He didn't live past the first day. There's a toy in that box. I made it for him before he was born." He looked at the table. "Margaret, my wife, she died 2 years later. She never really came back from losing him, not really, and eventually her body just followed where her heart had already gone." Cora was very still across from him. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me," he said, which came out rougher than he intended. "I know that," she said. He pressed his mouth together. "Emma didn't do anything wrong. She was dusting. It was covered in dust. She knows that. I'll tell her." "She'd appreciate that," Cora said, which was neither soft nor demanding, just honest. He told Emma the next morning. Not everything. Not the whole weight of it, but enough. He found her at the kitchen table before the others were up, and he sat down and said, "I was hard on you yesterday about that box. You weren't doing anything wrong, and I spoke to you wrong, and I'm sorry for that." Emma looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she said, "Did someone you love put something in it?" He was caught off guard by the directness of it. "Yeah," he said. "Someone I loved put something in it." She nodded, slow and serious. "We have a box like that too. It's got my dad's watch in it. Mama doesn't open it much anymore, but she can't throw it away either." She looked at him steadily. "I won't touch yours again." "You can dust the shelf," he said. "Just leave the box." "Okay," she said. She went back to whatever she'd been doing, and he sat at the table for a moment, mildly undone by a 12-year-old, and drank his coffee. The 20th day brought the first real crisis. The temperature dropped 12 degrees overnight without warning, November, making a decision. And when Silas went out at 5 in the morning, he found that the water line to the livestock had frozen solid, and 2 of the younger cattle were already showing signs of stress from inadequate water. He spent 2 hours in the brutal cold working on the line and got it partially functional, which was better than nothing but not good enough. And by the time he came back to the house, he was cold to the bone and behind on everything else, and in no kind of mood. Cora had breakfast ready, which he barely noticed, and coffee, which he drank in 3 long swallows standing at the counter. She watched him without comment for a moment and then said, "What do you need?" Line's half frozen. I've got 2 cattle that need watching. The temperature's going to stay down. What do you need? She said again, more specifically. He looked at her. Can Noah carry water to the east pasture? I've got a barrel on the sled, but I need someone to… Show me where, she said. You don't need to… Show me where the barrel is and which pasture, she said, in a tone that was not arguing with him, was simply removing the option of argument from the table. And I'll send Noah with specific instructions, and he will do it correctly because you've already shown him enough that he'll know what you mean. He showed her. She sent Noah with very precise instructions. Noah did it correctly. Silas worked the line. By mid-morning, it was as good as it was going to be for the season, and the cattle had water, and he stood in the east pasture and watched Noah lead the sled back toward the barn with a focus and a care that made something in his throat go thick. That evening, he sat at the table after dinner, still tired, and Lucy climbed up on the chair beside him. No preamble, no warning, just appeared, and put her small hand on his arm and said, "You look like when I'm too tired to cry." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." She patted his arm twice, very firmly, like she was reassuring him of a fact. Then she went to bed. He sat there after she left and noticed that the house smelled like food and wood smoke and, very faintly, from somewhere, like the dried flowers Cora had found in some forgotten corner and hung near the window, because she said a house needed something that remembered summer. He noticed that none of those things were his, and that all of them made the room better, and that he was, without having made any conscious decision about it, afraid to imagine the house without them. He'd known this was a risk. He told himself 2 weeks ago that he was being careful, that he was keeping appropriate distance, that he was simply fulfilling an arrangement and being responsible and not letting himself get attached to anything he hadn't agreed to. He'd been lying to himself, and he'd been doing it in that practiced, disciplined way of a man who's had a lot of practice. The question now, the one that kept him awake that night long after the house was quiet, was what he was going to do about it. He could keep the walls up. He'd maintained them for 11 years. He was good at it. He knew exactly how it felt to let the cold in and call it safety, to keep people at a careful arm's length and tell himself it was wisdom. He also knew, lying in the dark, listening to the wind and the unfamiliar breathing of a house that was no longer empty, that the arm's length was already gone. Had been gone, probably, since the moment a 5-year-old girl in red mittens told him his house smelled sad and wasn't wrong. The real question wasn't whether he'd let them in. They were already in. Had been in for weeks, coming through every unguarded moment, every shared morning, every fence post and water barrel and quiet conversation at a kitchen table. The real question was whether he was brave enough to stop pretending he hadn't let it happen, and what it would cost him if he did. Outside, the November wind pressed against the windows. Inside, for the 23rd night in a row, the fire burned until morning. He made it another 9 days before everything broke open in the barn. It wasn't planned. None of it was planned. That was the thing about the moments that actually changed a person. They never arrived on schedule. They came sideways, in the middle of ordinary work, when the defenses were down because there was a harness to mend or a water line to check, and the mind was occupied with practical things and not paying attention to the doors it had left unguarded. It started because of Noah. The boy had been pushing lately, not in a defiant way, not in the way that made a grown man's jaw tighten, but in the quiet, persistent way of someone who is trying to figure out where the boundary actually is. He'd been asking more questions about the cattle, about the land, about the property lines, and what the acreage looked like in spring. Good questions, smart questions, questions that told Silas the boy had been thinking about this place not as somewhere temporary to wait out the winter, but as somewhere he was trying to understand in a deeper way, and that understanding unsettled Silas in a manner he couldn't quite justify to himself. On the 32nd day, Silas came into the barn mid-morning to find Noah not working on the task he'd been assigned, restacking the hay along the north wall, but instead standing in front of the old tackboard where Silas had a rough map of the property tacked up alongside some notes about the south pasture drainage issue he'd been meaning to address for 2 seasons. Noah had a piece of charcoal in his hand, and he'd been adding something to the edge of the map. Silas stopped. "What are you doing?" Noah turned around fast, not guilty exactly, but caught. He looked at the charcoal in his hand like it had appeared there without his knowledge. "I mapped the fence line we walked, the one with the post problem. I thought if you could see where the drainage runs under it, it might explain why that whole section lists west, the water's pulling the ground. Silas walked over and looked at what Noah had drawn. It was rough. The boy was 10, not a surveyor, but it was accurate in its logic. The drainage line he'd sketched ran exactly where Silas had always suspected the problem was, had just never had the time to properly trace. He stood there looking at that map for a moment. "You walked the drainage line too?" he said. "Last week," Noah said, "after the fence. I didn't touch anything. I just walked it." Silas looked at him, at this 10-year-old boy standing in someone else's barn with charcoal on his fingers, trying to solve a problem that wasn't his to solve, and doing it with a methodical intelligence that his dead father had clearly handed down to him. Silas felt something move in his chest, not pain exactly, but adjacent to it, something that lived right next to pain. "Your hay's not restacked," he said. "I'll do it now," Noah said immediately. "Yeah," Silas said. "You will." He paused. "And after that, you can walk me through what you marked on that map. Because you might be right about the drainage." Noah's face did something complicated and quickly controlled. "Okay," he said, in a voice that was working very hard to stay even. Silas went back to what he'd come in to do. But he was aware, in the particular careful way he'd been aware of everything in this house for 5 weeks now, that he'd just given the boy something he hadn't intended to give. Not permission to be in the barn, permission to matter. And those were two very different things, and one of them had consequences Silas hadn't finished calculating. The confrontation came that same afternoon. He'd been working on the old draft collar that needed new padding, the kind of tedious leather work that kept the hands busy and left the mind too free, when he heard the barn door and assumed it was Noah coming to walk him through the map. He didn't look up right away. "The drainage line runs about 40 feet further east than I marked," he said. "Before you show me what you drew, I want you to—" "It's me," Cora said. He looked up. She was standing just inside the barn door with her arms crossed, not in an angry way, in the way a person crosses their arms when they're cold, and also holding something in that they're deciding whether to let out. Her breath was coming in small white clouds. She'd come without her coat, which meant she'd left the house quickly, which meant something had happened or she'd made a decision suddenly and followed it before she could talk herself back. "Noah do something?" he asked. "No," she said. "Noah's fine. He's inside with the girls." She walked further in, stopped about 6 feet from him. "I want to talk to you." "All right." "Not about the ranch," she said. "Not about the arrangement. About you." He set this collar down, looked at her. "Cora, I know you don't want to," she said. "I know that's the last thing you want. But I've been watching you for 5 weeks pull away every time something gets too close, and I think you're about to do it again in a bigger way. And before you do, I need to say something." He kept his expression even. "You don't know what I'm about to do." "You were kind to Noah this morning," she said. "I heard it from inside. And now you've been in this barn alone for 4 hours, and you haven't come in for lunch." She met his eyes. "That's what you do. Something gets through, and then you put 3 more walls up to make sure it can't happen again." The accuracy of that landed harder than he wanted it to. "I've got work to do," he said. "That's not Silas." She said his name in a way that wasn't soft and wasn't harsh, just direct, like she was setting something on a table between them. "I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm asking you to stop pretending that what's happening in that house isn't happening." The barn was very quiet. Wind outside, the mare shifting in her stall, the particular smell of hay and leather and cold air that Silas associated so completely with solitude that having another person standing in the middle of it felt almost physically strange. "What do you think is happening?" he said, and he meant it as a deflection, but it came out sounding like a real question, which was worse. Cora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My son is mapping your property because he stopped thinking of it as yours and started thinking of it as something he wants to understand. My daughter left a mended piece of harness on your workbench 2 weeks ago because she couldn't think of any other way to say thank you, and she'd watched you long enough to know what language you speak." She paused. "And Lucy asks about you when you're not in the room. Not constantly, just she notices when you're not there. She's 5. She doesn't know yet that she's supposed to protect herself from noticing things like that." Something in his face moved. He controlled it, but not fast enough. "And you, Cora said, quieter now. You split extra kindling and leave it where I can find it. You fixed the loose step on the porch without saying anything. You moved the lamp in the back room because you noticed Emma was straining her eyes reading with the old position. She wasn't accusing him. Her voice was level, almost careful. Those aren't things a man does when he's keeping his distance. He stood up. Not toward her. Just up, needing to move, needing to put his body somewhere different from where it had been. He walked to the far stall, put one hand on the wood, looked at the mare. She turned her head to look at him with that liquid, uncomplicated attention that animals gave and people rarely did. I told you about my son, he said. His voice was flatter than he intended. You know what happened. I know what you told me. Then you know why. He stopped. His jaw was tight. He could feel it. I know why you're afraid, she said. I'm not saying the fear isn't real, Silas. I'm saying you're using it like a weapon against yourself. He turned around. You don't know what it cost me, he said, and there was something in his voice now that had been sitting behind everything for 11 years, and he could hear it and couldn't pull it back. You lost your husband. That's a terrible thing. I know that's a terrible thing. But Margaret, she didn't just die. She died because she never stopped grieving. She grieved herself all the way out of this world, and I watched every day of it, and I couldn't... His voice broke slightly. He pushed through it. I couldn't reach her. I was right there, and I couldn't reach her. And before that was the boy. One day. He had one day, and then he was gone, and I had made him a toy, and I never... He pressed his mouth shut, opened it. I have loved people, and I have watched them go, and I did not survive that twice by being careless about what I let in. Cora had not moved. She was watching him with an expression that wasn't pity. He would have closed down entirely at pity, but something more honest than that, something that looked like recognition. I know, she said. You can't know. James died in 20 minutes, she said, kicked by a horse he'd handled 100 times. I was inside making lunch. He was gone before I got to him. 20 minutes, and my children lost their father, and I lost the only person who knew every version of me I'd ever been. Her voice was steady, but it had weight in it, the kind of weight that doesn't shake because it's been carried so long it's become part of the posture. I know what it is to watch someone disappear and not be able to stop it. I know what it is to lie awake thinking about everything you could have done differently, even when there was nothing you could have done differently. And I know what it is to decide that the only safe thing is to stop needing anyone that much again. He looked at her. I made that decision, she said, after he died. I decided I was done. I was going to raise my children and run my house, and that was going to be enough. And I wasn't going to let anyone close enough to leave a hole when they left. She paused. And then the money ran out, and the house wasn't mine anymore, and I had 3 children, and I had to figure out what was next. So I wrote letters to a bureau in St. Louis, and one of the letters came back with your name on it. You make it sound like it was simple, he said. It wasn't simple, she said. Getting on that train was the hardest thing I've done since I buried James, because getting on that train meant admitting that my decision, to be done, to be closed, to be safe, wasn't going to hold. That I needed something I'd told myself I was never going to need again. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid, Silas. I'm asking you to consider that being afraid and moving forward anyway is the only way this works, for either of us. He was quiet for a long time. The mare shifted. The wind moved against the barn walls with a sound like something patient and ongoing. What if it goes wrong? He said. And he didn't mean the arrangement. They both understood he didn't mean the arrangement. It might, she said simply. I can't promise you it won't. Nobody can promise you that. People leave, people get sick. Things fall apart in ways you never planned for. She didn't look away from him. But Silas, you're already losing things by not letting them in. You've been losing things for 11 years. You're just doing it slowly enough that it doesn't feel like loss. That one landed somewhere he hadn't been protecting. He turned back to the mare and stood there for a moment with his hand on the stall and his back to Cora, and he was aware that what was happening right now was exactly the thing he'd spent 11 years building walls against, and that the walls were down and he hadn't even seen it happen. They'd come down in the way walls always came down. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, kindling by kindling, fence post by fence post, one honest conversation at a time. I'm not good at this, he said. Nobody is, she said, People who are good at it are usually faking. Something in him that had been wound very tight for a very long time shifted, not released. It wasn't that clean, that simple, just shifted, like a knot loosening one loop before it's ready to come all the way undone. He turned around. "The toy I made," he said, "in the box. It was a horse, carved from a piece of walnut wood off the old tree in the east pasture. I started it the month before he was born." He looked at his hands. "I finished it 2 weeks after he died because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and I thought—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought. That finishing it meant something, that leaving it unfinished was worse." Cora was listening in that particular way she had of listening, where her whole attention went toward what was being said without filling the space around it. "I've never told anyone that," he said. "I know," she said. He almost said, "How do you know?" But he understood that she knew in the same way she knew most things about him, by watching carefully in the same way he watched and understanding what she saw. It was, he realized, one of the things that had gotten through the walls when he wasn't looking. The quality of her attention, the fact that she looked at him and saw something she didn't immediately try to fix or explain or soften. "I'm not asking you to open the box," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready for. I just needed you to know that what's happening in that house, with my children and with me, I see it. And I'm not going to pretend I don't see it just because it's easier." "It'd be easier," he said. "For about a week," she said, "and then it would be something else." He walked back to the workbench and sat down, not to pick up the harness, just to sit. He pressed both hands flat on the bench and looked at them and then looked at her. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone quieter," he said. "Someone who needed more." She tilted her head slightly. "I need plenty. I'm just not in the habit of making it someone else's emergency." "Yeah," he said. "I've noticed that." She almost smiled. The same almost smile from the depot, the one that stayed just short of completing itself, the one he'd found himself thinking about at inconvenient moments. "So," she said, "what do we do?" He thought about it honestly for the first time without immediately building a wall around the answer. "We keep going," he said, "like we've been going, but He stopped. "I'll stop pulling back when it gets close. I'll try. I can't promise I'll be good at it." "I'm not asking for good," she said. "I'm asking for honest. That I can probably manage." "Probably," she repeated, a dry edge to it. "Maybe probably," he said. She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that he couldn't fully read, and then she said, "Noah is going to want to walk you through that map." "I know. And Lucy is going to ask you at dinner what your second favorite color is. She's been working up to it. Despite everything, despite the weight of the last hour, the excavation of things he'd kept packed down for 11 years, the particular exhaustion of having been seen clearly by someone he was not ready to be seen clearly by, he felt something happen at the corner of his mouth. "What's my second favorite color?" "I have no idea," Cora said, "but I'd think about it before dinner." She went back to the house. He sat in the barn for another 20 minutes, not working, just existing in the strange new shape the afternoon had taken. Then he went and looked at Noah's map. The boy had found the drainage line exactly. He'd been right about the west lean of the fence posts. He'd walked the land and understood what he was looking at and marked it correctly with a piece of charcoal, and he was 10 years old. Silas stood there looking at that rough, accurate, earnest map and felt something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. Not happiness. It wasn't that clean yet. But something adjacent. Something that pointed in the direction of forward rather than back. At dinner that night, Lucy waited until everyone had their food and then looked at Silas with the gravity of someone raising a matter of great importance and said, "What's your second favorite color?" Emma closed her eyes. Noah looked at the ceiling. Cora looked at her plate with her almost smile. Silas thought about it with appropriate seriousness. "Green," he said. "The green the pasture goes in early April, before the real heat comes, when it still looks like it's surprised to be alive." Lucy considered this for a long moment. "That's a real person answer again," she said, satisfied. "That's the only kind I've got," he said. She nodded and went back to her food, and across the table Cora looked up briefly and met his eyes. And what passed between them in that moment wasn't large or dramatic. It was something quieter than that. Something that said, "This is real, and we both know it, and neither of us is going to pretend otherwise anymore. That night he took the box down from the shelf. He didn't open it. He wasn't ready to open it. But he took it down and held it for a long time, sitting by the fire after everyone was asleep, feeling the weight of the walnut wood and the years inside it. And then he set it on the mantel, lower, reachable, not hidden, and went to bed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. It was something more like acknowledgement, the first step of a longer walk, taken in the dark, without any certainty about where it would lead. But taken. That was what mattered. After 11 years of standing still, he had taken a step. Outside, December had moved in quietly while no one was watching, laying frost across every surface, making the world look clean and sharp and cold. Inside the ranch house at the edge of Ash Hollow Crossing, 4 people breathed in the dark, each of them carrying wounds that hadn't finished closing, each of them choosing, without ceremony, without guarantees, to be in the same place anyway. The fire burned until morning. It always did now. Neither of them had ever said a word about it, and neither of them needed to. December settled over Ash Hollow, crossing the way it always did, without apology, without warning, just a steady tightening of the cold until everything outside the walls of a house became an act of endurance rather than living. The ranch changed in winter. Silas had always known this, had lived through 11 of them alone, but this December felt different in a way he couldn't attribute to weather. The work was the same. The feeding, the checking, the constant vigilance against frozen lines and sick cattle, and the 100 small emergencies that a frontier winter invented on a daily basis. But the house he came back to after that work was not the same house. It had noise in it now. Not chaos, not the kind of noise that frays a person, but the low, continuous sound of a place that is inhabited by people who are learning each other. The particular acoustic texture of 4 people sharing space with increasing ease and increasing honesty. Emma had started keeping a log of the household supplies. Nobody asked her to. She'd found a spare ledger in the back storage room and simply begun recording what came in and what went out. And the first time Silas looked at it, she'd left it on the kitchen table, open, not hiding it, but not announcing it either. He found it was accurate to the last pound of flour. He didn't say anything to her directly. He went to town that week and came back with 2 more ledger books and left them on the kitchen table without comment. And by morning they were gone, presumably put somewhere in Emma's careful organizational system. That was how they communicated, the 2 of them, in objects left in visible places, in tasks completed beyond what was asked. It wasn't warm exactly, not yet, but it was a language, and they both spoke it. Noah had been working with Silas on the drainage problem every afternoon when the weather allowed. They'd traced the full line now, mapped it accurately, and Silas had spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table working through what it would take to address it properly come spring. New channels, rerouting the runoff away from the south fence line, which would solve not just the listing posts but a secondary problem with the east pasture that had been bothering him for 2 seasons. Noah sat across from him on those evenings, not always talking, sometimes just doing his own work. The reading Cora assigned him, the letters she made all 3 children write to practice their penmanship. But present. Companionably present. And Silas had found, to his own quiet astonishment, that working through a problem with another person in the room was different from working through it alone in a way he had forgotten was possible. He was, in the most careful and unannounced way he could manage, becoming accustomed to them. That terrified him on a low frequency. He'd decided to stop fighting. Cora had said, honest. He was trying for honest. What honest felt like most days was a man walking a fence line. He knew was unstable, testing each post before he put his weight on it, not because he planned to stop walking, but because he needed to know which ground would hold. The crisis came on a Thursday night, 3 weeks into December, at 2 in the morning. He heard it in his sleep first, not a sound exactly, more like a change in the quality of the night, some shift in the air outside the barn that reached him even through the walls of the house. He'd been a rancher long enough that his sleep was never fully off. He was at the barn door in his coat and boots in under 4 minutes. The heifer was down. She was one of 2 he'd been watching, young, first pregnancy, further along than he'd fully accounted for, and she'd gone early, which happened, but she'd gone early and hard and wrong, and Silas could see within 30 seconds of entering the stall that this was not going to resolve itself. He needed to get the calf turned. He needed to do it now. and he needed, practically speaking, a second pair of hands. He went back to the house and knocked twice on Noah's door, sharp and quick. The boy was awake in seconds. He came to the door with his eyes still adjusting to the lamp and his hair uneven from sleep, and Silas said, "Heifer's down, calf's turned wrong. I need help." Noah reached for his coat without a word. Silas almost said, "You don't have to." He didn't say it because Noah was already pulling his boots on and the heifer was out of time. Cora appeared in the hallway. She took in Silas's face and the lamp and Noah's coat and said, "What do you need from me?" "Stay with the girls," Silas said. "Keep them inside." She nodded. No argument, no additional questions, just nodded. And the clean efficiency of her trust in that moment, was something he filed away without having time to examine. Back in the barn, the heifer was making sounds that no living thing should have to make, and Silas went to work with the focused, deliberate calm of someone who has been in situations like this before and knows that panic kills more than the situation does. He talked Noah through it as he went, not because the boy needed a lesson right now, but because talking kept them both grounded. "Hold here." "Yes." "Don't pull yet." "When I say." Noah did everything he was told without hesitation, without flinching, his jaw set and his hands steady in a way that Silas noticed even in the middle of everything. It took 40 minutes. It felt longer. There were 2 moments in the middle where Silas genuinely wasn't sure how it was going to go, and in those moments he kept his voice level and his hands moving and didn't let his face show what he was thinking. One of those moments, he looked up and saw Noah watching him with the same controlled steadiness and thought. His father really did teach him something. And then there was no more time for thinking because the calf was coming and it needed both of them. The calf was alive. It was small and not out of trouble yet and would need watching, but it was alive and the heifer was alive. And when it was over, Silas sat back on his heels in the straw and breathed for a moment in a way he hadn't let himself breathe for the last 40 minutes. Noah was across the stall, equally still, staring at the calf with an expression that was part exhaustion and part something he didn't have words for yet. "You did good," Silas said. Noah looked up at him. In the lamplight, the boy's face was tired and serious and something else, something that was trying very hard not to be too large about itself. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, meaning the heifer. "I think so," Silas said. "We'll watch her tonight, probably taking turns." Noah nodded. "I can take first watch." Silas looked at him. "You know what you're watching for?" "Distress. If the calf can't nurse in the first hour, that's a problem. If the heifer's breathing changes." He paused. "My dad had cattle, not as many, but I've seen a birth before." Silas stood up, slow, feeling the cold in his knees that always got worse when he'd been on the barn floor. "Okay," he said. "First watch is yours. Come get me at 4. He almost went back to the house. He stopped himself, turned back, and said something he hadn't planned to say. "Your dad would have been—" He stopped, started differently. "That was a hard thing you did tonight. You didn't hesitate." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't want to let you down." Silas heard that sentence from the inside out, heard what it actually contained, and had to turn away briefly and look at the calf. "You didn't," he said. And then, because he meant it, and because honest was what he'd promised, not even close. He went back to the house. Cora was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that she'd obviously made for something to do while she waited, and she looked up when he came in. He told her what happened, tersely, just the facts. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The calf is alive?" "Yeah." "And Noah's okay?" "He did better than okay." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment, and he could see her processing that. Processing what her 10-year-old son had just done in a freezing barn in the middle of the night, and what it had cost him, and what it had built in him. She swallowed once, carefully. "Thank you for taking him," she said, "for not leaving him out of it." "He was the right choice for the job," Silas said. Which was true, and also not the complete truth, and they both knew it. He sat down across from her, and she got up and poured him a cup of coffee without asking, and they sat at the kitchen table at 2:40 in the morning, not talking about anything large, just existing in the specific exhausted quiet that follows a crisis that ended the right way. And Silas thought, this is what it is. This is exactly what this is. A woman at a table with coffee and the relief of something surviving the night. And it was ordinary in every way, and it was also the thing he hadn't had in 11 years, and both of those things were true at the same time. The first person in Ash Hollow Crossing to say something directly was Harlan Wicks. Silas had expected it to come from somewhere. Ash Hollow Crossing was a small town with a long memory and a reliable appetite for other people's arrangements. He'd known since November that the depot scene had traveled. Old Tom Garrett had seen to that, and Tom Garrett was the town's most efficient distribution network for information he had no business with. What Silas hadn't anticipated was where it would land hardest. He'd taken the wagon into town on a Saturday to collect supplies, Noah alongside him because the boy had been asking to see more of the town, and Silas had no good reason to refuse. They were loading sacks at Wicks's general store when Harlan came around the end of the counter with his particular smile, the one that thought it was friendly and wasn't. "Heard you took in the widow after all," Harlan said. "She's working the house," Silas said. "I need someone to work the house." "3 children, though," Harlan said, with a tone that sat just inside the edge of sympathy without actually being sympathy. "That's a weight nobody signed up for. People been talking about that." Noah had gone still beside the flour sacks. Silas could feel it without looking at him. "People can do what they want," Silas said. Harlan leaned against the counter. He was 53, had run the general store for 20 years, and had built his sense of his own importance from the combination of those two facts. "Just saying what I'm hearing. Raising another man's get, nobody thinks less of you for having second thoughts. Woman came under false pretenses, way I understand it." "You understand it wrong," Silas said. His voice was even. He was working to keep it even. "Well," Harlan spread his hands, reasonable. "The Bureau made an error, I know. But the fact is, you took on more than you bargained for, and folk wonder if you're—" "Harlan." Silas set the last sack in the wagon and turned to face him. "I'm going to tell you something once. The woman is keeping my house and doing it better than it's been done in 11 years. Her boy walked a drainage line on my south pasture that I'd been meaning to trace for 2 seasons and mapped it correctly on his first attempt. Her older girl keeps every supply record in a ledger that's more accurate than anything I've managed myself. And her youngest—" he stopped briefly. "Her youngest reminds me every single day that there are things in this world worth showing up for." He held Harlan's gaze. "That's what I've got on that ranch right now. So whatever folk are wondering, they can wonder it in a different direction." Harlan had no good response to that. He managed a tight nod and went back behind his counter. Noah was loading the last 2 items without being asked, and his face was turned away, but Silas could see the set of his jaw. That same jaw, Cora's jaw, the one that absorbed things and didn't let them go until it had decided what to do with them. On the drive back, Noah said, "You didn't have to say that." "I know," Silas said. "People are going to keep talking. People always keep talking. That's the primary function of small towns." A pause. "Does it bother you?" Silas thought about it honestly. 11 years ago it would have. Now I'm more interested in what's actually on my property than what people think about it. Noah was quiet for a minute. Then, "My dad used to say that a man who needs the whole town's good opinion doesn't actually have any opinions of his own." Silas looked at the road. "Your dad said a lot of good things." "Yeah," Noah said. "He did." Another pause. "You say good things too. They're just shorter." Silas didn't have an answer for that. He drove. But something in his chest had a quality to it for the rest of that drive that was not entirely unpleasant. The harder confrontation came not from town, but from Cora's side of the territory entirely, and it arrived in the form of a letter. It came in the 3rd week of December, postmarked from a town called Redfield, which Silas didn't know, addressed to Cora in a handwriting that was forceful and backward slanting in the way of someone who wrote with either impatience or anger. She read it at the kitchen table while the children were doing their lessons in the back room, and Silas watched her face while she read it in the way you watch a person's face when you're close enough to them now that their expression has started to mean something to you. Her face went very still. She folded the letter, set it on the table, looked at it for a moment like it was something she was deciding whether to pick back up. "Who's it from?" he asked. He was at the counter. He'd been repairing a belt buckle and he set it down. "James's brother," she said. "Edmund Whitlock." She said the name with a flatness that told him everything about the quality of that relationship before she said another word. He heard I'd come out here. He wants to know what arrangements I've made regarding the children's future. Meaning what? She looked up at him. Meaning he thinks he has a claim on Noah, the oldest boy of his dead brother. He's got a farm in Redfield, no sons of his own. He's been wanting... She stopped, set her hands flat on the table. He tried to take Noah when James first died. I didn't let him. He's been waiting to see if I'd fail badly enough that he'd have legal ground. The buckle on the counter, the fire in the grate, the sound of Lucy's voice from the back room, telling Emma something about a picture she'd drawn. All of it very ordinary, very quiet, and underneath it this thing that Cora had been carrying that he hadn't known about, hadn't even thought to ask about. The whole shape of a threat that had been sitting over her family before she ever set foot in Ash Hollow Crossing. He doesn't have ground, Silas said. He has money, Cora said, and a lawyer in Redfield, apparently, and a belief that a widow with nothing is in no position to argue. You're not a widow with nothing. She looked at him. He looked back at her. You're working a ranch. You've got a roof and income, and... He stopped. Started again, more carefully. He can't take Noah from his mother without a court order, and he'd have to show neglect or inability to provide. That's not what's happening here. It's not what's happening right now, she said. But if the arrangement changes, if I have to leave, the arrangement's not changing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Silas, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. Edmund Whitlock is not someone who lets things go. If he decides to push this, it will be public, and it will be ugly, and it will follow you. It will follow the ranch. I understand that. I don't think... Cora. He waited until she looked at him. I said the arrangement's not changing. That means it's not changing regardless of Edmund Whitlock and his lawyer and his opinions about what a widow with nothing deserves. He picked the buckle back up. Write him back and tell him Noah is well housed and well provided for and learning ranch skills from a working cattle rancher. Tell him to address future correspondence to me directly. The quiet that followed was the particular kind of quiet that happens when something shifts weight between two people. When something that had been held by one person is set down and picked up by another, not transferred but shared, redistributed, and both of them feel the change in pressure. You don't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. I'm doing it anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the letter and went to the writing desk in the corner and sat down, and Silas went back to the buckle, and the fire burned, and from the back room Lucy could be heard explaining to Emma in great detail why orange was the best color for a horse, and Emma could be heard disagreeing with quiet patience, and Noah's voice came in occasionally with a measured observation that sided with neither of them and satisfied nobody. Silas listened to all of it. He didn't look up from the buckle, but he listened. And something in him that had been waiting for a long time to know what it was still doing here, in this house, with these people, in this life that had cracked open in November and was still, slowly, finding its new shape. Something in him settled. The reply to Edmund Whitlock went out the next morning. Cora wrote it, and Silas signed his name at the bottom, beneath hers, and they didn't discuss at length what that meant, because they were both past the point of needing to discuss the obvious. The letter came back unopened 3 weeks later. No explanation, just returned. They never heard from Edmund Whitlock again. The town didn't fall silent after what Silas had said to Harlan Wicks, because small towns never fell fully silent, but it shifted. This was the other thing about Ash Hollow Crossing. It had a long memory, but it also, when pushed, had a basic sense of fair dealing, and a man who stood in a general store and said plainly what he had on his property and why he valued it was a man who was heard, not universally respected, but heard. Old Martha Gellis, who ran the post office, and whose opinion traveled further than Tom Garrett's because she was smarter about how she dispersed it, had apparently been watching the situation since November and had revised her view somewhere around the time she noticed that the Boone Ranch was buying double provisions and that the Whitlock children were, by all accounts, behaving like children who were being raised properly. Martha Gellis said something to two people, and those two people said something to others, and by January the tenor of what Ash Hollow Crossing was saying about Silas Boone's unexpected household had shifted from gossip with an edge of scandal to something closer to grudging recognition. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. The frontier didn't give acceptance freely or quickly, but it was something, and something was a start. On a Saturday in late January, Cora took all three children into town for the first time. Silas had offered to come. She'd said, "We need to be able to do this on our own," and he'd understood that, understood it in the same way he understood most things she said, not just the surface of it, but the principle underneath. She needed the town to see her as something other than a woman under someone's protection. She needed to walk into Ash Hollow Crossing and be herself, all by herself, and let whatever happened happen without him there to buffer it. They were gone 4 hours. When they came back, Emma was carrying a small bolt of cloth she'd traded one of her ledger services for. Apparently, Martha Gellis had discovered Emma's organizational abilities and offered the trade herself. Noah had a new length of rope, proper working rope, a quality he couldn't afford otherwise, which Silas suspected had come from a source he'd ask about later. And Lucy was wearing a small paper flower that someone had made for her, stuck behind one ear with supreme 5-year-old confidence. Cora came in and stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at Silas and said, "Martha Gellis wants to know if the children will be in the spring social." He looked at her. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd ask you," she said. And there was something in how she said it, "I'd ask you," that was different from how she might have said it 2 months ago. It wasn't deference. It was inclusion. 2 different things. "Tell her yes," he said. The children went to the back room. Cora poured water for the kettle. Silas sat at the table and looked at the window and the January gray outside it and thought about spring socials and drainage lines and a 10-year-old boy who walked fence lines before he was asked, and a 12-year-old girl who mended harness straps as a form of thank you, and a small person with a paper flower behind her ear who had decided at some point around day 3 that Silas Boone was not a closed door. He thought about Edmund Whitlock's unopened letter. He thought about Harlan Wicks's face when he'd said, "She reminds me every single day that there are things in this world worth showing up for." He'd meant it. He'd said it in the heat of the moment, but he'd meant every word, and the fact that he'd meant it had been sitting with him since, a quiet revelation he was still walking around and looking at from different angles. There were things worth showing up for. He'd stopped believing that for a long time. He'd gotten very good at the business of existing without believing it, which was its own kind of skill and not one he was proud of. He was, at 42, in the middle of January, on a ranch at the edge of a small frontier town, with a woman at his stove and 3 children in the back room and a calf in the barn that had survived against reasonable odds. He was learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable resistance, how to believe it again. That night, after supper, Lucy fell asleep at the table before anyone could get her to the back room, face down on her folded arms, paper flowers still behind her ear. Emma looked at Cora. Cora looked at Silas. And Silas, without discussion or deliberation, got up and lifted Lucy carefully from the chair and carried her to her bunk. And she didn't wake up, and her paper flowers survived the transit, and he stood at the door of the back room for a moment looking at the 3 of them. Lucy asleep, Noah reading by lamplight, Emma adding to her ledger, and felt something so large and so uncomplicated that he had no word for it. He went back to the kitchen. Cora was at the table. He sat down. The fire was going. Neither of them said anything for a while. There was nothing that needed saying right now that hadn't already been said, or that wouldn't be said better later when they both had the words for it. The silence between them had changed from the careful, measuring silence of 2 strangers figuring each other out into something with more ease in it, more room. Outside, the January wind moved across the prairie in long, cold sheets. The ranch sat in the middle of it, lit from within, holding its own against the dark, in the particular stubborn way of things that have decided to survive. That was enough, for tonight. That was exactly enough. February came in mean and stayed that way. 3 weeks of temperatures that made the morning chores feel like punishment. 2 more frozen line breaks. 1 section of roof on the old storage shed that finally gave up under the ice weight and came down on a Tuesday afternoon with a crash that brought everyone running. Nobody was hurt. The shed was a different story. Silas stood looking at the collapsed section with his jaw tight and did the arithmetic in his head. Materials, time, what could wait until spring and what couldn't, and felt the specific fatigue of a man who is managing more than one thing at the edge of his capacity. Noah stood beside him doing his own version of the same arithmetic. Silas had started to recognize that expression on the boy. The focused, forward-looking calculation that meant he was already 3 steps ahead into the problem. "The east wall's still solid," Noah said. "If we shore up the beam that's leaning, we can keep that section usable through the rest of winter. The collapsed part can wait for proper repair when the ground thaws." Silas looked at him. "You're right." Noah nodded, not with pride exactly, more with the satisfaction of someone who had been paying close enough attention for long enough that being right was starting to feel like a reasonable expectation rather than a surprise. That was its own thing to observe. Watching a boy learn to trust his own judgment under conditions that required it. They shored up the beam that afternoon, the two of them, with Emma keeping Lucy occupied indoors and Cora doing the work of 3 people in the kitchen, while also making periodic appearances at the shed door, to assess progress with the quiet competence of someone who needed to know if the situation was under control without inserting herself into a process that didn't require her. Silas noticed her doing that and recognized it for what it was. Not hovering, not anxiety, just the practical monitoring of someone responsible for 4 people's winter survival, who trusted the people doing the work, but maintained situational awareness anyway. He'd started noticing a lot of things about Cora that he didn't have categories for previously, because his previous categories for people had been worn down to 2, those who needed something from him, and those who didn't bother him. She fit neither, and the novelty of that kept producing small recognitions at unexpected moments. The way she made decisions, quickly, without excessive second-guessing, then adjusted when the decision proved wrong without treating the adjustment as a failure. The way she listened to the children, which was differently than most adults listened to children, with actual attention, not the performed attention that was really just waiting for them to finish. The way she'd started leaving the lamp burning in the kitchen on the nights when he was late coming in from the barn. Not because he'd asked her to, and not because it was a large gesture, just because it was useful, and she was someone who did useful things without requiring acknowledgement for them. He was in serious trouble, and he knew it, and he was not entirely unhappy about knowing it, which was its own new and peculiar experience. The thaw came in late March, tentative at first, a week of temperatures that climbed above freezing in the afternoon before dropping back down at night, the kind of thaw that got your hopes up and then took them away. And then, in the first week of April, for real. The ground went soft. The creek ran loud. The pasture came up green exactly the way Silas had described to Lucy. Surprised to be alive, that particular green that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to hold. Spring on the ranch meant a change in the work's texture, not less, never less, but different. The urgency shifted from survival to building, from maintaining against loss to actively creating something for the season ahead. The drainage project became real work now, not planning. Silas and Noah spent the better part of 3 weeks on it, digging new channels, rerouting the south pasture runoff along the line Noah had first mapped back in December with a piece of charcoal and a 10-year-old's careful eye. It was hard physical work, and Noah did it without complaint through sore muscles and blistered hands, and one afternoon when he sat down in the dirt at the edge of the channel and didn't get back up for 10 minutes, just sat there with his arms on his knees and his head down, spent. Silas crouched beside him. "You can go in." "I'm not going in," Noah said into his knees. "I'm not telling you to. I'm saying you can." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he lifted his head and looked at the channel they'd dug, at the new line of it running clean and purposeful through the south pasture. "How much more?" 2 days, maybe 3. Noah looked at his hands, looked at the channel, looked at Silas. "Okay," he said, and got back up. Silas didn't say anything. He handed the boy his spade and went back to his own section, and they worked until the light went, and neither of them mentioned it again, because that was the language they'd built, the one where things that needed doing got done, and the doing of them was the statement. The spring social arrived in the second week of April, which was a Saturday, and the whole of Ash Hollow Crossing had been building toward it the way small towns built toward their few communal occasions, with a combination of genuine anticipation and exhaustive organizational disagreement. Martha Gellis ran it, as she ran most things in town that required any degree of coordination, and she had sent specific word through the post office that the Boone household was expected. Cora spent the Friday evening before it doing something with her hair that involved pins and a level of focused attention that Silas hadn't seen her give to anything that wasn't a practical problem, and Emma sat across from her at the table doing the same thing with her own hair in what appeared to be deliberate parallel, occasionally glancing at her mother and adjusting. Lucy had decided her hair was fine as it was, and had instead been persuaded, over about 45 minutes of negotiation, to allow Emma to braid it so it would stay out of her face. She sat for approximately 3 minutes of the braiding process before she started providing a running commentary on everything visible from her position, which was mostly the ceiling and the lamp. Noah came into the kitchen in his cleanest shirt, looked at the situation, and wisely retreated to the barn. Silas was at the table with coffee, watching all of this with the expression of a man who was not going to offer an opinion on any part of it. "You could at least comb your hair," Emma said to him, without looking up from her own. He looked at her. She looked briefly at him and then back at the mirror glass Cora was holding. He got up and combed his hair. The social was in the church hall, the building used as the church hall, since the town used it for everything that required a large indoor space. And it was loud in the way of events where 50 people who haven't been in a room together since November suddenly are. Long tables with food, a cleared space at one end where someone had set up for music later, children running patterns between adult legs, the low roar of conversation that came from people who had been isolated by winter and were now compensating. Silas had been to these things before. He'd been to them alone, stood at the edge of them with his coffee, and gone home early, and nobody had thought much of it because that was what Silas Boone did. He arrived at this one with 3 children and a woman, and felt the shift in the room's attention, the way you feel a change in wind direction. Not dramatic, just there, a collective noticing. He stood it without flinching. Cora stood beside him with her chin at that particular angle, not challenging, just present, unapologetically taking up the space she was standing in. And Noah stood on Silas's left with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set. And Emma had Lucy's hand and was steering her with the focused attention of someone responsible for a small but highly volatile element. Martha Gellis appeared from somewhere to the left with the speed of a woman who had planned her arrival. She was 60, with gray hair pinned in a style that hadn't changed in 20 years, and eyes that took in everything and cataloged it for future reference. She shook Silas's hand, nodded at Cora with something that was genuine rather than performative, told Emma that she hoped the ledger system was going well. Emma said it was. And then crouched down to Lucy's level and said, "And you must be the one who's been keeping everyone entertained." "I don't know what that means," Lucy said pleasantly, "but probably yes." Martha Gellis laughed, which was not something she did frequently or quietly, and the 3 people nearest to them turned to look. And the looking people saw Martha Gellis laughing with the Boone household's smallest member, and something in the room's calibration adjusted. Harlan Wicks was there. He nodded at Silas from across the room with the careful nod of a man who had been publicly corrected and had chosen, with the limited dignity available to him, to pretend the correction had been a reasonable exchange of information rather than a dressing down. Silas nodded back. That was the end of it. 3 other men found reason to talk to Silas about ranch business. The drainage project had apparently circulated through the farming community as a topic of interest, because 2 of them were dealing with similar problems on their own land. Noah stood at Silas's elbow through these conversations and contributed once, precisely, with a detail about the channel angle that was correct and that the men registered as surprising coming from a boy his age, and that Silas registered with a particular quality of feeling he was still learning to identify without embarrassment. Later, when the music started, Lucy pulled Cora onto the cleared space and began moving with the cheerful technical incorrectness of a child who is dancing to the music she hears inside her own head rather than the one being played. Cora danced with her, unconcerned about audience. Emma watched from the edge of the floor with the expression of someone who wanted to join and was not ready yet to be the one to decide to. A girl she didn't know appeared beside her and said something, and Emma said something back, and 10 minutes later they were both on the floor near Lucy. Noah sat down next to Silas, and they watched all of this in the companionable silence that had become their default language. "Good thing you combed your hair," Noah said. Silas looked at him. Noah was watching the dancing with a slight expression that was working very hard not to be a grin. Emma was right. Occasion like this, you want to look like you tried. Did I ask for your opinion? No, Noah said. I offered it free. Silas looked back at the floor. Cora was laughing at something Lucy had done, and the laugh was real, the kind that came without warning and took over the face completely, and Silas looked at it for longer than he meant to before he looked away. She laughs like that sometimes at dinner, Noah said, quieter now, not teasing. When you say something that catches her off guard, she doesn't do it on purpose, it just happens. Silas said nothing. My dad used to say that you could tell how comfortable someone was with you by whether they laughed before they thought about it. Noah paused. She laughs like that with you more than she did in the first 2 months. Silas kept his eyes on a point across the room. Your dad said a lot of things. He was usually right, Noah said. Gets annoying, honestly, when someone's not around anymore and they keep being right. That landed, lightly and precisely, in the exact place it was aimed. Silas absorbed it without showing what it did to him, because that was the language too. He asked her that night. He hadn't planned to ask her that night. He'd been carrying it around for weeks. Not the question exactly, more the shape of what he wanted that the question was the entrance to. And he told himself he was waiting for the right moment, which was partly true and partly the old habit of finding reasons to wait dressed up in the language of patience. The social had done something to his timeline. Seeing her in that room, watching her hold her own in a community that had been deciding what to make of her, watching Emma find a friend and Noah earn the attention of grown men who knew what they were looking at, watching Lucy dance with that total, undefended joy. He'd driven home with all of it sitting in his chest like something physical, and by the time the children were in bed and the house was quiet, he had run out of reasons to wait that he respected. She was at the kitchen table with her tea, doing the thing she did at the end of some evenings where she just sat without a task for a few minutes, which she never did in the first month and did more frequently now, which he had understood as a sign of something settling. He sat down across from her. She looked up, read something in his face, set the tea down. I'm going to say something, he said, and I need you to let me get through it without stopping me, because if I stop, I won't start again. All right, she said. He put his hands flat on the table, looked at them. When you got off that train in November, I was ready to send you back. Not because of who you were. I didn't know who you were. Because of what I'd decided about what I could manage, what I was willing to risk. He looked up at her. I've spent 11 years building a life specifically designed so nothing could get in far enough to matter. And I thought I'd gotten good at it. I thought that was... He stopped. I thought that was wisdom. I was calling it wisdom. She was watching him with her full attention, the way she listened, without filling the space. What it actually was, he said, was slow dying. Just slow enough that I'd stopped noticing it. He pressed his mouth together briefly. Your daughter told me this house smelled sad the first night she was here. She was 5. She was right. Not because I hadn't maintained it or kept it functioning, because nothing in it had... He stopped again. This was the part he hadn't rehearsed. Nothing in it had any stake in tomorrow, including me. Cora's hands were folded on the table. She wasn't moving. Your children have changed my property, he said. The drainage works now. The supply ledger is better than anything I've ever kept. The barn doesn't feel like a place I go to be alone anymore. He looked at her steadily. And you have changed. He stopped. You've changed what tomorrow means to me, what I'm doing this for, what the point is. The kitchen was completely quiet except for the fire. I'm not good at this, he said. I've told you that before and it's still true, and it's probably going to stay true. I'm going to be too quiet sometimes and too much inside my own head, and I'm going to take too long to say things I should say sooner. I know that about myself. He looked at her. But I don't want to do this as an arrangement anymore. I want to do this as... I want you to marry me. Not because of the letters or because of what I need the house to run or because of the winter. Because I cannot imagine a morning from here forward where you and those children are not on this property, and I don't want to. Cora looked at him for a long moment. The fire moved. Outside, the April night was still cold, but differently cold than February. Cold that had a direction to it, that was moving towards something rather than just pressing down. You're sure, she said. Not a challenge, a question with real weight in it. I'm sure, he said. I've been sure for longer than I've been ready to say it, which is a problem I'm working on. The corner of her mouth moved. The problem of being ready. Yeah. You know it won't be simple, she said. 3 children. Edmund Whitlock may not be finished, whatever that returned letter suggests. The town is warming up, but it's not warm and it may not fully get there. The ranch is better than it's been in years, he said, and the town can take its time. And Edmund Whitlock is welcome to write to me directly as many times as he likes. He paused. None of those things are reasons. They're just weather. Weather happens. The question is whether you want to be in the same house when it does. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was aware that he was probably holding his breath, which was undignified, and that he was doing it anyway, which felt honest. Yes, she said. It came out simply, without ceremony, the way she said most things that mattered, like the truth didn't need decoration. He breathed out. Okay. Okay, she said back, and her almost smile completed itself for the first time, actually arrived all the way, and it was something. It was a real thing. He stored it somewhere he hadn't used in 11 years and found there was still room. They were married on the first Saturday in May, in the same building where the spring social had been held, because it was the only building in Ash Hollow Crossing large enough, and because Martha Gellis had organized it with an efficiency that suggested she'd been waiting for the opportunity. It was small, 15 people, maybe 18, and it was not elegant. Silas's suit needed a button resewn, and he noticed it 20 minutes before the ceremony and could not find a needle, and Emma produced one from somewhere in her organizational system and fixed it with 3 minutes to spare, without comment, which was very Emma. Lucy wore a yellow ribbon in her hair, the yellow that was almost orange, and insisted that this was formally her contribution to the occasion. Nobody argued. Noah stood beside Silas. He was 11 now, had turned 11 in March, and he was standing there in his good shirt in the role of best man, with the gravity of someone who understood what that meant and intended to honor it. Before the ceremony, while they were waiting, he said to Silas very quietly, "You're going to be good at this." Silas looked at him. "You don't know that." "I know you taught me to walk a fence line before I asked," Noah said. "And you went and got my mother a second cup of coffee for 6 weeks before you admitted you noticed she needed one. And you carried Lucy to bed when she fell asleep at the table without making it a thing." He looked up at Silas with the old measuring expression, the one from the depot platform, except that it had changed. It had softened somewhere along the fence line and the water barrel runs and the 2 in the morning calving. "I've been watching," he said. "That's how you do things. You do them before you announce them. That's going to work fine." Silas had no response to that, which was becoming a pattern with Noah, and he suspected it was a pattern that was going to continue for the next several decades, which was not a problem he was unhappy about. They said what needed to be said in front of 15 people and Martha Gellis in a room that smelled like spring through the open windows, and whatever Cora had baked that morning, which was sitting on the back table, and which Lucy had already attempted to access twice and been redirected both times. When it was done, Martha Gellis shook Silas's hand and said, "Took you long enough." "It took me exactly as long as it took," Silas said. "That's what people who take too long always say," Martha Gellis said pleasantly, and went to organize the food. The summer was the hardest and the best season the ranch had seen in years, which was a combination Silas hadn't experienced enough to be fully prepared for. The drainage project held. The south pasture produced better than it had since the second year he'd owned the land. The calf that he and Noah had pulled through a February night of crisis grew into a healthy animal that Noah had, without formally announcing it, named February, which Silas found out when he heard Noah refer to the animal by that name to Emma, and which he declined to comment on because it was, objectively, a reasonable name. Emma's ledger system expanded to cover the ranch operations as well as the household. By July, she had a cross-reference record of feed costs, cattle weight gain, and supply expenditure that was more detailed than anything Silas had attempted. And when he sat down to look at it one afternoon, she sat across from him and walked him through it with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing this work for months and knew it was good. He looked at her, at this 13-year-old girl who had arrived in November with her jaw set and her arms full of a crate and her heart locked down tight against another loss, and said, "This is excellent work, Emma." She looked at the ledger. "I know," she said, which was not arrogance but accuracy, and which made him press his mouth against a smile because it was the most Cora-like thing she'd ever said. Lucy turned 6 in June and had opinions about everything. She had decided that she was going to be a rancher, which she announced at dinner with the finality of someone issuing a formal declaration. Silas asked her what kind of rancher. She said the kind that had horses. He told her that running cattle and running horses were different operations. She said she'd do both. He looked at Cora. Cora looked at her coffee. He told Lucy that when she was older, they'd talk about it. She accepted this as a commitment, which meant it was a commitment, and he understood that. He started teaching her to approach the horses without startling them. She was fearless, which was the one thing about her that required the most work. Fearlessness in a child and fearlessness around large animals were not a combination that could be left unsupervised. But she had patience she didn't use on most things, and she had the quality that some people just had around animals. That particular calm frequency that horses and cattle could read. And Silas watched her stand at the fence with her small hand out, and the mare come over and lower her head, and he thought, she's going to be something. Not in a vague way. Specifically, concretely. This child was going to be something, and he was going to be there to see it, and that was a fact he had not let himself look forward to anything for long enough that the looking forward itself was something he had to learn to do again, like a muscle not used. The wooden horse came down from the mantel at the end of that summer. Silas did it on a Sunday afternoon in September, when the house was quiet and the light was the particular gold of early autumn. He took the box down and opened it for the first time in 11 years. The toy was exactly as he'd left it, walnut wood, small and solid, the carving rough in places where his hands had not been steady. He held it for a long time, sitting by the window, turning it in his hands. Then he put it on the kitchen table. Cora came in from outside and stopped when she saw it. She looked at it, then at him. "I kept it put away," he said, "because putting it away felt like protecting it. Like if nobody touched it, it was still—" He stopped. "I think I was wrong about that. I think things that are important should be where people can see them. Not because it doesn't hurt anymore, just because the hurt and the love are the same thing, and you can't honor one by hiding the other." She sat down across from him. She didn't touch the toy. She looked at it. "He would have been 12 this year," Silas said. "I know," she said. He looked up at her. "You know?" "You told me the night you told me about him," she said. "I've been counting." She met his eyes. "I think about him too. I know he wasn't mine to think about, but I do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the wooden horse on the table between them, this small carved thing that had been a promise made before it could be kept, that had been carried in grief for 11 years, that was now sitting in the light of a September afternoon in a kitchen that smelled like people and wood smoke and dried flowers and the specific complicated life of a house that was full again. "It belongs out here," he said finally, "on the shelf where people can see it." He put it on the mantel shelf, lower than before, at a height where Lucy would eventually be able to reach it, which he understood was a risk and accepted deliberately. It sat there in the September light, and it was what it had always been and also something new. Not a wound anymore, or not only that. More like a hinge, the thing on which the before and the after of him turned. Lucy noticed it 2 days later. She stood in front of the fireplace and looked at it very seriously and said, "Did you make that?" "Yes," he said. "For who?" He thought about it for a moment. "For someone who didn't get to use it," he said, "but who I still think about." She looked at the horse and then at him with the enormous, uncomplicated eyes that still managed, even now, to see things adults spent a lot of effort not seeing. "Can I hold it sometime?" "Sometime," he said. "When you're a little older?" She nodded, satisfied. "Okay," and went outside, already on to the next thing, the way children moved through the world with that blameless momentum that only the young had, forward and forward and forward. He watched her go and stayed standing in front of the fireplace for a moment. Years passed. Not quickly. Years on a working ranch never passed quickly, because they were full of weather and work and the particular density of a life that required daily presence. The south pasture stayed productive. The cattle herd grew in slow increments, carefully managed, never beyond what the land could carry. The storage shed was rebuilt properly in the summer following its collapse, better than the original, Emma recording the material costs and comparing them to 3 different suppliers until they found the best price, which saved them money they put toward fencing the following spring. Noah worked the ranch through his adolescence and into his early 20s with an increasing authority that was not a challenge to Silas's but a genuine development of his own, a man growing into the place his aptitude had always been pointing. He was 22 when he brought a girl named Clara home for Sunday dinner, a rancher's daughter from 3 counties east, with dark eyes and the kind of direct manner that reminded Silas enough of Cora at the depot that he had to look at the table for a moment to control his expression. Clara shook his hand with a firm grip and said she'd heard the Boone Ranch had the best managed drainage system in the region. He told her Noah had designed it when he was 10. Clara looked at Noah. Noah looked at the table. Cora refilled the coffee. Emma moved to the county seat when she was 20, took work in the regional land office where her organizational mind found a scale commensurate with its ability. She came back for harvests and winters and wrote letters the rest of the time that were precise and detailed and occasionally dry in a way that made Silas read them twice because the second reading was funnier than the first. She married late, at 28, a cartographer, which nobody who knew her was surprised by. Lucy became a rancher, not the horse rancher she'd declared at 6. Life adjusted that ambition into something practical and still hers, but a cattle rancher on the adjacent property that she and her husband purchased when she was 25, running an operation that was profitable within 3 years and that asked Silas for advice regularly and ignored approximately 40% of it, which he considered a healthy ratio for an adult child and said so. The ranch grew, not into something unrecognizable, so it remained a working cattle ranch on the frontier, subject to weather and cattle prices and the ordinary cruelties of agricultural life, but into something that had the specific density of a place where people had lived and worked and made decisions together over time. The fences held. The drainage held. The kitchen table gained chairs over the years as the household expanded and contracted and expanded again, with grandchildren who arrived with the same range of temperaments that their parents had arrived with, though none quite so immediately present as Lucy, who had been from the first moment simply herself. On an evening in October, 22 years after a November train had arrived in Ash Hollow Crossing with more people on it than expected, Silas sat on the porch in the particular cold of early autumn that he had never fully stopped bracing against and probably never would, and looked at the land. The pasture was going brown now, the way it went in October, and the fence lines ran straight and clean and solid to the south where the drainage had been set right by a 10-year-old boy with charcoal on his fingers. The ranch was quiet in the late evening way. The stock settled, the work done for the day, the particular stillness that came after effort when everything that needed holding was held. Cora came out and sat in the other chair. She had a quilt, which she split without asking so that half covered his legs too. He didn't comment on it because they were past the point of commenting on the ordinary ways they had learned each other's needs over 2 decades, past the point where every act of consideration needed to be marked. It was just what was, and what was enough. Lucy's bull got into the east fence again, she said. I know, he said. Noah's going to ride over tomorrow. She's going to argue. She always argues, he said. Then she does it the right way. Cora pulled the quilt a fraction higher on her side. She got that from you. She got it from you, he said. I just demonstrated it more quietly. She made a sound that was halfway to the laugh, the real one, the one that still happened before she could think about it. He heard it and felt, at 64 years old, on a porch in October, exactly what he had felt the first time he heard it, which was the feeling of something in him that had been braced for a very long time releasing, not all at once, but enough. He looked out at the land in the October dusk and thought about what it had looked like 22 years ago, before the fire burned through till morning and a woman with her chin up walked away from him across a depot platform without looking back. He had almost let that train take her. He had almost stood in that cold and watched his future leave and called it a reasonable decision, had almost protected himself so thoroughly from the risk of loss that he'd preemptively lost the thing he was most afraid of losing, not a person, but the capacity to need one. And he'd been so certain in that moment that he was being wise. The bravest thing he'd ever done was say her name, not fighting through a winter, not pulling a calf at 2 a.m, not standing in front of Harlan Wicks and saying what he had on his property and why he valued it, not any of the things that looked like courage from the outside. Just saying her name in the cold before the train moved, saying it because he'd looked at the back of her and understood that the thing he'd been calling safety for 11 years was actually a very slow and very private kind of ruin, and that the only way out of it was through the exact thing he was most afraid of. Cora. One word, and everything after it. He looked at her now in the dusk, at this woman who had walked away from him without begging, who had taught him that dignity was not the absence of need, but the refusal to let need become performance, who had brought 3 children and a cracked open heart and a dead man's watch in a box, and the undefended willingness to try again onto a train going west, and had sat at his table and told him the truth about both of them and let him decide what to do with it. She was looking at the land too, probably seeing something different from what he was seeing because she'd always seen the thing next to the thing he was looking at, which had driven him crazy for years, and which he now understood was not a different way of seeing the world, but a larger one. "The walnut horse," he said. She looked at him. "Lucy asked me last week if she could have it, for her daughter." He paused. "I told her yes." Cora was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you sure?" "It was made to be held," he said, "not kept in a box, not kept out of reach." He looked at the pasture. He would have been someone. I don't know who. I think about that sometimes. Not with the old kind of hurt, more like curiosity, like thinking about a road you didn't take and wondering what was on it. He paused. "But the road I did take is this. You. These children. This land." He said it plainly, without reaching for anything larger than what it was. "I don't want to hold things back anymore." She reached over and put her hand on his. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That was one of the things about 22 years with a person. The conversation that mattered most didn't always require words. Sometimes it was just two people sitting in the same direction, in the October cold, under half a quilt, having both of them arrived at the same place by roads that should never have crossed but had. The prairie went dark around them slowly, the way it always did out here. Not all at once, but by degrees, the light pulling back from the edges first and then the middle, until the stars were out and the ranch sat below them, still and held and lit from within. Inside, on the mantel shelf, the small walnut horse waited in the dark. Not a wound, not a monument, just a thing made with love, waiting to be passed forward. The way most true things were, when you finally understood how to hold them.